Toward Europe and brief biography of Lal Krishna Advani ji. So these all even he is a very well known face on the TV channels, news channels, debating on several issues. There's he's on been on DD News, Times Now, ABP News, and so on. So without taking much time, I just pleased to be invited as Sriman Prafulla Ketkar ji. Ji, bhai sab namaskar.
Namaste and good morning to all. I thank Yuva and the entire team for organizing this and giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts on this topic of so-called left and their lies and their frauds. Let me start with an anecdote, an experience. I was studying in JNU, and that time globalization was a buzzword. And obviously, criticizing American globalization was a fashion from both the sides, the so-called right and so-called left. Both were skeptical about what was happening in the name of globalization. And we were undergoing a course on the globalization and state. And when one faculty member was talking about this, the pitfalls of globalization and how it is American imposition and all those things. The Cold War had just ended, so I asked one question. I asked, sir, is it the problem for you is with the globalization as a concept itself, or you are against the American globalization? And in other words, I asked, if the Cold War would have ended, hypothetical question, if Cold War would have ended other way, means USSR would have won and USA would have collapsed, what would be your position vis-a-vis globalization? And there was a stoic silence, because I asked whether you have a problem with dollar globalization. If this would have been a ruble globalization, the Russian currency, what would be your response? And surprisingly, the so-called left did not have any answer, because throughout the Cold War, they were votaries of going with the USSR. Here we need to understand the basic fundamental problem. Marx is the first person who actually spoke about the globalization. He is the one who created one model based on the European experience and imposed it for the entire world. And so workers of the world unite, and everywhere there will be capitalism, everywhere there will be. So there was a prism to see the world. Now, I personally believe that there is nothing called left or right anymore. Left liberal is the biggest dichotomy, biggest oxymoron. I will come to it later. But even left and right doesn't exist in India. Because originally the idea of left that came in Europe was in the context of French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, the the forces that were opposing the monarchy adopted the revolutionary means, and then they started calling themselves as left. So left stood for the change. Left stood for the uh, anti-status quo. Left stood for the you know continuous progressive thought, and that's why I believe that in India uh, there are two kinds of um, one is the thoughts that are rooted in the Indian soil, and the other that are non-Indian, the European or the Anglo-Saxon way of seeing the Indian reality. Now we will go to the you know a kind of myth or the kind of lies uh, they have created and perpetuated over the period of time. But who are they? So I believe that they are essentially the so-called left intellectual colonizers. Now you see in the mm, intellectual discourse that there is no uh, right-wing intellectualism. All intellectuals are left-wing. This is the first lie and first myth. Because I'm not going into the the counter view because I don't consider myself as right. I consider myself as Indian point of view. But what they have done, they have killed the plurality of thoughts in social and academic life, imposing the idea that British left has been perpetuated on Indian academic and intellectual. What is that fundamental law that we need to understand? The Communist Party of India was formulated in Moscow in 1920. It was supposed to be the part of Comintern. Comintern, Communist International, was the first expression of globalization. It was a communist globalization, not capitalist globalization. Now, essentially, all these thought processes want to create uniformity. They see the world uniformly. They want to impose, uniform values, uniform social structures, and that's why they see the entire world either as a capitalist world or the communist world. And there are certain proponents of global caliphate also who see the entire world as the Islamic world. But essentially, they want to see the entire world in one form, which they see as ideal. And that is the fundamental problem. So the communism cannot go with plurality. There is no basis for plural thought in communist ideas. It is imposition. You see Russia, you see China, you see Cuba, or even the so-called left in European or mm, American intelligentsia. This is the first myth they have created. Now, in Indian context, it becomes more complex. In India, since the independence period, there have been three uh, ideas of India uh, that are being debated. Now, this is the most fundamental fault line of India's intellectual and academic world. The first myth, the first, uh, um, Hemanji, I request you to put yourself on mute. Uh, the first uh, idea about India was created by the British colonizers, intellectuals, historians, who said uh, India was never a nation. India can never be a nation. Uh, so India is nation in the making. So India is nation in the making. Who is making that nation? Now there is the entire debate going on as Mughals as nation builders. But British started this debate actually, and British themselves projected as nation builders. So you are never a nation. You were never a nation. You are nation in the making, and that's why, unfortunately, when our independence, uh, we attained the independence, we accepted this thought that we have to make a new nation. Then there was another thought that came in 1920 called the communist thought, which said India was never a nation. India was never a nation. India is conglomeration of many nationalities, but communism essentially doesn't believe in idea of nation. Many people ask me why communists and Islamists come together. The simple thing is because of two fundamental agreements. One, none of them believe in the idea of nationhood, Rashtra, and uh, uh, both the ideologies basically um, believe in the means of violence. So that brings them together. They are natural allies. But in Indian context, as I was saying, communists created this idea, and for many Western um, communist intellectuals, this was a natural thing because for them, um, how can a French and a German and a British cannot be one nation? Then how can a Kannada speaking and a Tamil speaking and a Assamese speaking and a Kashmiri speaking can be one nation? This was a big dilemma. This was a very difficult thing to understand because language and religion became two bases for nation state formation in Europe. And anyways, the idea of communism doesn't believe in the idea of nation state. They want to believe in communes and the entire world has to be in some one order. So they created, so 17, 18, 25, there are different numbers, but essentially India is not one. But from ancient period, there has been one thought that believed that India is one nation, Rashtra, not in the modern sense of nation state, but a nationhood. And that thought was there during the Vedic period, during the period of Guptas and uh, Harshas. Even when Shivaji was talking about his Hindavi Swarajya, he was not talking about Maharashtra. He was always talking about Himalayas. We have letters testifying this. At the same time, we see this flow going on from Bhakti movement, Vivekananda, Arvindo, entire spiritual uh, dimension of idea of India always believe India to be one nation put on cultural, geocultural life. So what we achieved under British period, what we started building post independence is the state. Now the so-called left has an art of taking over the state. They don't believe in Rashtra, they don't believe in people. Rashtra constitutes people. So they don't work much among people, but what do they do is basically take over the state. The Nehruvian idea of India gave that space to the so-called left to virtually take over the Indian state, especially the intellectual sphere. And that's why you see, despite not being in power on pan-India basis, the so-called left has controlled the academic and intellectual. Now, one of the another important thing, left always ask, the communists always ask questions, constitution and constitution making, and especially to the people coming from the ideology of Hindutva, they always raise this question because the ideology of Hindutva represents this third version of Rashtra, where they see the cultural or civilizational continuity of this nationhood. That we might have linguistic differences, we might have cultural, different festivities, different food habits, but when it comes to the idea of India from Himalayas to Indian Ocean, we have one concept of Rashtra, and therefore we never had a problem in people traveling from Tamil Nadu to going to up to Kashi or Haridwar and worshipping their gods, or people coming from uh, some part of Maharashtra and becoming priest in some temple of Tamil Nadu or Kerala. Never had this issue simply because uh, the worldview of India among the people was same. The relationship with the land was same. The language may change, the the, the expression, but left never understood this. The academic, the so-called liberals also never understood because they both carry the Western prism to see India. So the second lies about them is about the commitment to the constitution and democracy. The fact is, the so-called left boycotted India's constitution-making process, and they never believed in parliamentary democracy. In fact, even when they joined the democratic process, the one part of left, uh, it was more as a part of uh, tactical rather than conviction. Because for them, parliamentary democracy is bourgeois, promoting capitalism. So they are using uh, the democratic structures to further their revolutionary goals. And therefore, you see, wherever left rule, take the case of Kerala, take the case of Bengal, even earlier Tripura, wherever they rule, they tried to finish the opposition. The media was taken over. The state institutions were run by the communist cadre. The police machinery is, the only states where police machinery has labor unions based on political lines are Kerala and Bengal. And therefore, you see a immediate mobilization of cadre within the state. Your bureaucracy, your police machinery, your everything get politicized on the party line, and then you force people to follow the certain line, even within the Communist Party. You take CPI Maoist, you take CPI ML, you take CPI M, or you take traditional CPI. Any kind of difference of opinion was treated as enemy. Any kind of uh, opposition to any or questioning to any thought was treated as the uh, class enemy. And this is a very unique concept of communism. It's very easy to brand because communism, like Islamism, is also based on a book, and anybody going out of that is called as revolutionary, revisionist, and branded as enemy of the class struggle. So, who was the biggest enemy of class struggle during the entire freedom movement of almost up to 1960s? You go to the communist document. publications, speeches, and you will get Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was the biggest enemy because one important uh, part of Indian social structure that has been problematic for the so-called left has been the caste. Now, remember, whether CPI, whether CPI ML, whether CPI uh, Maoist now, you will not find a single person rising to the top position coming from either scheduled tribe or scheduled caste. But they will always ask questions to others, as if they are out of everything. Means Jyoti Basu will never unfurl a flag, even as chief minister. But they will always ask questions to others. Okay, why didn't you, accept tricolor? So we are above being answerable. We are not accountable. That has been, this sense of intellectual supremacy, which is actually hypocrisy, because they take funding from the state, carry on the project, they create their own people who are paid to perpetuate one particular thinking like a horse. And then you talk about plurality, you talk about democracy, you talk about intellectual freedom. There cannot be bigger hypocrisy. But as I was saying, Ambedkar was the biggest enemy of the class struggle. And that's why Ambedkar was also very skeptical about the communists. Ambedkar said, mm, communism is an ideology. In 1937, Mysore Deprex Class Mission Conference, he was chairing the session, and he said, "I can be anybody but communist, because communists use the labor class and downtrodden for their political ends. They use them. They don't fight for them. They don't fight for their rights. They don't fight for giving them the equal treatment. They are not for resolution. They want to create enmity in the society. They believe in violence. And therefore, Baba Saheb Ambedkar's Buddha and Marx, perhaps the best exposition of Indian point of view of equality and equanimity, egalitarian approach, and the Western, where he is comparing Marx and Buddha. So this is the third, uh, lie and hypocrisy about the entire. Now, the fourth thing is about communist lie is about irreligious. They call it secularism, but original idea of communism was that religion is opium of masses. This is another reason why India is very difficult for them to understand. For them, religion is used to keep, keep people away from the secular issues, the issues of livelihood, the issues of, you know, economic existence, material existence. They don't understand that in Indian context, as Swami Vivekananda said, it is not the crying need of India when he was talking to the missionary in the US on 11th September to 29th September, he gave speeches in Chicago. And he said, why are you coming, to spread religion? We don't require that. We have enough of it. In fact, we are the ones who have taught the world that how multiple religions can emerge, coexist, and flourish together. This is the only land in India. Uh, so, but for communists, it's irreligiosity. So even during the independence struggle and post-independence, this irreligiosity was imposed. Anything talking about Indic thought, Indic religion, uh, were considered as backward, considered as, not modern. Now, you tell me, a person who is worshipping his land and taking care of his land with traditional values through different festivities, even worship his bulls and cows, is a progressive agriculturist, or the person who is ruining his land through pesticides and chemicals is the progressive one? But this idea was imposed through the state. And now, when the land is destroyed, the same so called left and liberals are telling that no, 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 basically go for organic farming. This is the natural thing. But if you see the entire documentation in 1970s, now the idea of planning, the way it was adopted from Stalin's idea. Now, for 5 years, for a state like India, with a huge population and a big landmark, you are planning from New Delhi and imposing what is good and what is bad for Kerala or Himachal or Northeast or uh, uh, Rajasthan and Gujarat. The beauty of India is this diversity that coexists. Now, communists always try to impose uniformity from uh, the, the, the centralization of power. Now, what has happened? All these things got exposed post 1990. This got exposed in Europe long back when Stalin came to power in the USSR. But with the collapse of Soviet Union, the only successful experiment of so-called revolution, which was not revolution of the proletariat, because as per the Marxist thought, when the capitalism grows to certain extent, then only revolution takes place. But it was not at all a capitalist country. It was a party's revolution. It was Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky's and all those people who actually grabbed the power from that. That's all. There was no capitalist class. So another lie. When you see the world as linear, that is always a problematic. India sees the world as circular. I always ask students, the biggest question of modernity that is being debated, discussed, is about uh, the nature of Earth. Even in Europe, the idea of secularism evolved around this question. And Galileo and Copernicus were the first scientists who actually questioned the biblical understanding or the church interpretation of Bible that the earth is flat. They questioned this. That's why they were persecuted. They were put in jail. They were forced to consume poison. Now, in Indian context, you see anywhere in Indian language, you will find a word called uh, the subject matter to study the earth is called Bhugol. The earth is spherical, at least for last 3,000 years. In all Indian languages, this has been the word. There was never a doubt. And there was, scientifically accepted, at least from Aryabhata's time, the way Indian mm, astronomy has worked. Mm, Then uh, you will find that not just Bhugol, but even Khagol, the universe is spherical, has been India's conviction and scientifically proven. Now, what has happened post 1990? The classical liberalism, classical communism is dead. The ideas of revolution and the party structure and mobilization of labor is completely relegated to the background. So left lots connection with the all trade unions and movements all over the world, including India. So they lost the ground. So they started building two types of strategy. One is by the party structure and people's leadership, they started building alliance with the so-called secularists and Islamists to further their objectives. What happened in India in terms of national security, uh, the National Advisory Committee of uh, Ms. Sonia Gandhi from 2004 to 14 was a classic example of. But what is happening post 2000 in the so-called the traditional uh, violent left, the Naxal, the Maoists, uh, because they are the ones who have been killing tribals, who they are the ones who are infiltrating in various institutions. They are the ones who loot, uh, the all the money that is going to the tribal areas. The developmental activities are stopped. The violence is perpetuated. They change the strategy, and the strategy uh, is uh, developed on the premise with the realization. See, if you see, there was a Naxalbari movement before the Telangana movement, uh, then Naxalbari movement, then CPI, ML, then People's War Group, uh, then there was the Maoist Communist Center, and then in 2003, all these uh, uh, you know uh, fractions who were divided on various ideological differences and leadership got together and they formed CPI Maoist. Now they made a strategy of uh, urban centers, urban centers and frontal organization. These became the two pillars of their strategy. So Kabir Kala Manch and uh, you know uh, various uh, organizations suddenly started floating in academia or in the name of uh, Periyar and Ambedkar and all these things you see is basically offshoots of this strategy. Mm. On the other hand, they realized that uh, there was one thinker called Gramsci, on the basis of which Mao adopted this idea of cultural revolution. See, if you see the classical Marxism, uh, there is a base. Base is basically constitutes the modes of production and the relationship of production. So all values, ideas, culture, all these things are basically superstructure. So if you change the base, superstructure will automatically change. You don't have to interfere in culture, identity. That was the traditional uh, Marxism. Gramsci was the first thinker who criticized this, and he said that no, it happens in the intellectual field, it happens in the cultural field. So you have to change the value, and you need to challenge the hegemonic culture. The so-called hegemonic culture is identified, and around it, various identities are created. What you are seeing today, that the identity of farmers, the identity of uh, uh, Dalits, the identity of tribals, the identity of women, they are systematically nurtured for the violent act so that uh, the model of democracy, even the corruption movement, anti-corruption movement was used for this purpose, so that the democratic structure is weakened. People lose faith in democracy. People lose their, uh, belief in democratic institutions, whether election commission, whether parliament, whether other constitutional mechanisms. Once that is weakened, and there are many identities that are created who are ready to adopt the violent means, then it becomes the ground for this anarchy becomes the ground for revolution. This is the new strategy they are working in the name of constitution, democracy, freedom of speech. So using all these as uh, mask to further the revolutionary violent goals. This is basically the the so-called left for you in India at present. This is not just an intellectual challenge. This is also a challenge for India's democracy, stability, civilizational legacy. So you will see mockery of Indian festivals, whatever attached to Hindu civilization is being mocked or negated. So from Holi to Diwali, everything is considered and projected as something anti-environment, anti-women, anti-certain social group. So there is a systematic strategy to further this, objective. Unfortunately, many Indians are uh, getting trapped in this, intellectual fallacy, and we also start seeing ourselves mm, from the European prism. Now, whether we really want to be unique and give a new, revived model to the world where we will celebrate uh, spiritual democracy, where everybody has the right to choose his or her own God, or deny the existence of God. That is permissible only in India, nowhere in the world. You have multiple uh, mm, cultural expressions and still believe in universal oneness. Uh, People talk about uh, certain global things. India is the only space which has been talking about the uh, entire universe. So we don't see even Earth as in isolation. We see in the universal context. Now that is very important thought process that world needs for global peace, global stability, security, and prosperity. It is ultimately this civilizational thought. China has the similar potential, but unfortunately, China got trapped in the Maoist thought. But China's either Confucian or Tao or Buddhist traditions, they have this ability to present a model, not the present communist one. So this is an intellectual challenge, and I believe that we should take take up this challenge and face the uh, uh, thing, because uh, if you see any conflict in India uh, in the name of any identity, you will find the communist brand behind it. So uh, we need to expose them. We need to uh, cut off their resources. We need to uh, uh, celebrate the true plurality of India, true drivers, true diversity, while realizing the inherent unity that has been the hallmark of our uh, civilization. And that's why I believe this effort by forums like Yuva is going to help and build a future intellectual warriors who will take on the hypocrisy, uh, because left doesn't believe in the so-called liberal, democratic, pluralist path. For the Indian modernity, for the Hindu modernity, that speaks about spiritual democracy, mm, diversity, while realizing the inherent oneness of entire living being, not just humanity, entire living being. The spirit is one, which science is also, pure science is also accepting now. If that thought needs to be uh, uh, established, then we need to take up this intellectual challenge, and we need to learn how to celebrate the universal ideas of India and not just the global, as somebody was putting in the chat box now. Uh, we need to uh, nurture those universal thoughts. We need to, on the one hand, expose who are non-Indian in understanding Indian reality. At the same time, we should put the, the the ancient Indian civilizational heritage in the modern context for the entire world. This is a dual process. Unless we take up this together, we will not be able to face the challenge of left, the so-called left and its allies. So I'll stop here. If there are any queries, questions, or some points to make, you are most welcome. Thank you again, you are for taking up this exercise and building future intellectual warriors.
Thank you, Prafulji. I see there are certain questions in the uh, chat box, and you have give answers to some of them. But I just like to point about one of the question that has been asked, that how do you see the recent crackdown on Chinese big techs by the communist Chinese government in the context of adopting more socialist policies by China? What could be impact of these actions on Chinese polity in the future?
See, to answer this, I will have to engage another lecture. But China is a very, curious model. Again, the problem is most of the Western thinkers and even some of the people in India with the so-called liberal capitalist perspective, they believe in the Western theory that economic liberalization will automatically lead to the political opening. What happened in the USSR, the erstwhile USSR, that the glasnost and perestroika will go together. So opening up of economy and political liberalization will automatically happen. In Chinese case, it is different simply because China has always had this obsession about the centralized authority. If you see the Qing dynasty, or even seven dynasties of China, always had this. The Middle Kingdom syndrome, they call themselves as Middle Kingdom, has always been there. So it is not very difficult for the Chinese common people to accept the centralized authority. For whom it is a problem? It is a problem for Tibet because it was not part of the so-called Middle Kingdom. It is a problem for Mongolia. It is a problem for Hainan. It is a problem for uh, mm, mm, East Turkmenistan, East Turkestan, basically. What you call China called now as Xinjiang is basically East Turkestan, and the areas like Hong Kong. So these are the problematic areas for China. So China is trying to impose the Han civilization on them, which is creating a problem. Um, now, this uh, entire exercise of economic liberalization post 1979, uh, started by Deng Xiaoping, is a very astute model. And recently, if you see, Xi Jinping has talked about, failing of the socialistic pattern of the Chinese characters, and there is concentration of wealth in certain groups, so it needs to be redistributed. It will certainly have an impact. The fall of Jack Ma is just a symptom. There will be many more Jack Ma's who will be falling in the coming days. But what will be the impact? It's very difficult to say right now. I feel that there is one group which is called as the princely, the dynasts of Chinese Communist Party. How the politics of Chinese Communist Party shapes up, that is going to be very crucial, because by next year Xi Jinping will be declaring himself as the chairman, or the core leader, what they call in Chinese Communist Party. So he will be considering projecting himself as equivalent to Mao. How does other fractions within the CCP, whether Hu Jintao or Xi Jinping, Jiang Zemin's group, and PLA, he has already taken over Xi Jinping. But there will be a lot of friction and resistance, and ultimately it will depend. Ultimately USSR also collapsed because Russian Communist Party got weakened. The similar thing might happen in China also. But as I said, China is a very complex situation. China is a civilizational state. China is different from Russia. So there will be, of course, communism has lost there also. There it is more the economic capitalism coupled with communist nationalism, Chinese nationalism. There is no communism actually there except the party control. The name is Chinese Communist Party, but there is no Means freedom of expression is not there, party rule is there, there is no election, there is no democracy. The communism is limited to that. But when it comes to the economic mode of production, it has completely reversed uh, uh, the so-called Marxist model. Uh, even the Mao's model is reversed by 1970. So in society there is a vacuum. The ideological traction that had for communism is lost. In the process, you have killed Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, whatever was existing. Now you are trying to revive that. So you see Confucius Center coming up all over the world with the Chinese funding. Even for Chinese Buddhism, they call it a different kind of Buddhism. So that realization is there because many Chinese are getting attracted towards either Tibetan Buddhism or European missionary activities are taking benefit of it because it is a vacuum. You don't have values, you don't have ideals. So people need spiritual solace, and there they are looking for some which communism failed to give. Marxism, Marxist or Maoist ideas failed to give. So it leads to frustration. Now there is a lot of Americanization that is appealing in the middle class of China. So they are resisting it. They want uh, Chinese values. They want Chinese family system back. So there are many contradictions that are coming up. And if I use the Marxist dictum, uh, Chinese Communist Party will fall, uh, out of its own contradiction, as any Marxist would tell you. It will not lead to any synthesis. There is a limit to manage this kind of structure. So there will be, but there are many more nuances in this entire process, which perhaps I can discuss sometime when we speak on or we discuss on China.
So thank you for such an insightful talk on this topic. Way back in 2016, when we were conducting our first session of first edition of Vimerge in 2016 at Gandhi Bhavan, on this topic, I heard Prafulla for the very first time, and at that point of time, I knew that I can listen to him again and again and again on this very specific topic any number of times, and with the very new and thoughtful ideas that he conveys in this on this topic are so refreshing and so intellectually directed towards the question itself. And when we thought of this topic that we need to organize a webinar on, unanimously everyone was of the favor that yes, Prafulla, no one is better than Prafulla on this topic. And yes, he has proved this again. So we are very much on the behalf of Yuva. I would like to thank you for your time and your insightful thoughts on this topic. I would also like to thank all the participants so that they took their valuable time and attended this session. In the nearby future, we'll be conducting such kind of sessions every month, and we'll be sending you all the details of the program. And till then, thank you very, very much. Thank you, Prafulla and the organizing team.
Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. Namaskar.